Today we're looking at the French and Indian War. Hello, welcome to the Daily Bellringer. Please don't forget to subscribe and take a look at the questions down in the description. So the French and Indian War lasted from 1754 to 1763 and was part of a larger world war known as the 7 Years' War that primarily pitted old enemies France and Britain against one another. Now you might be wondering why it's called the 7 Years' War even though it looks like the years don't really match up there. Well, you have to consider Britain did not actually declare war on France until 1756. So 1756 to 1763, that's 7 years. The French and Indian War was simply the North American theater of that bigger war and was fought for control of the North American continent. To find out why the war happened and how it started, see my other video on the causes of the war. One thing you have to consider during the war is the amount of time that it took for action to take place. You have to consider that the bulk of France and Britain's forces had to be taken across the Atlantic Ocean in order to even fight the war. But early on in the war, the French had much more success than the British. One major failed British offensive early in the war was the march to capture the French fort of Fort Duquesne, which sat at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, where present-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania sits. In the summer of 1755, new British commander of troops in North America, General Edward Braddock, along with George Washington, marched from Maryland towards Fort Duquesne. On July 9, 1755, they were ambushed by the French along with their Native American allies not far from Fort Duquesne at the Battle of the Monongahela. The British were severely beaten in the battle, being unable to deal with the guerrilla tactics being used by the French and Native Americans. General Braddock himself was mortally wounded during the battle and died of his wounds a few days later. As 1755 and 1756 wore on, the British suffered setback after setback, largely due to the fact that the American colonies could not work together to get anything done, and each colony wanted to maintain their own power. There was little support from England, since they were more concerned with the fighting occurring back in Europe, and of course you have to consider the fact that the French had many more Native American allies. In 1757, the tide of the war began to change as William Pitt became the new British Prime Minister, or the head of the British government. Of course, at this time there still was a king, of course King George that they had to answer to, but Pitt viewed the fight in North America as the key to winning the entire 7 Years' War and building a much larger empire for Britain. So, as many times as the case, Pitt began to throw money at the war and began borrowing money to finance the war. Now remember that's going to be very, very important later on. But the British also began committing more troops to fighting in North America. And in July of 1758, the British won their first major victory at the Siege of Louisbourg at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. From there, they went on to capture Fort Duquesne in November of 1758. Of course, the French actually burnt Fort Duquesne before the British captured it, so the British built a new, much larger fort and named it Fort Pitt, of course named after William Pitt, and that's where we get the name for the city of Pittsburgh today. On September 13, 1759, the British troops under General James Wolfe climbed the cliffs overlooking the city of Quebec and defeated the French on the Plains of Abraham. During the battle, both the British commander and the French commander were mortally wounded and killed. Then in September of 1760, the British captured Montreal, and now the French had lost their last stronghold in Canada. As the British continued to win victories, more and more Native American tribes went over to the British side, sensing that it might be in their best interest to be aligned with the British when the war ended. But also at the same time, Spain entered the war on the side of France, hoping to maintain some of their colonial territories in North America once the war was over. In February of 1763, delegates from Britain, Spain, and France met in Paris and worked out a treaty to end the war, of course known as the Treaty of Paris, but I'll cover the outcome and that treaty in another bell ringer. The war for North America had lasted for almost 9 years and had transformed from a war that started over claims into a world war being fought on separate continents and involving several nations. In the end, the war would set the stage for a revolution that would come over a decade later and result in the independence of the American colonists. So, with that, hopefully you learned something, and thanks for watching.